Hi, Jeff Marshall, President of Morgan Works. I'd like to spend a few minutes of your time talking about the concepts of critical thinking and resiliency. We'll use two case studies. One is Man Gulch, a fire that happened in 1949, and the Battle of Bloody Ridge at Guadalcanal in 1942. Before we start, I'd just like you to think about the two images that we've got on the title slide here. The image on the left is the Celtic tree of life, and you can see the branches coming down and uniting with the roots. There's really a seamless interconnection between branches and roots. Everything is connected in some way, shape, or form. And as we look at a problem, as we look at a crisis, we cannot just look at the pieces by themselves and expect to be able to resolve the situation. We've got to understand how it all fits together. The yew tree, I think, is a wonderful example of resiliency. It's able to reinvent itself. The trees live for hundreds of years. They take what nature throws at it, and they adapt, they transform, and survive. So keep that in mind as we go through this. Now, the two case studies, as I said, are Man Gulch and Bloody Ridge. In Man Gulch, the Forestry Service saw a fire burning in the Man Gulch area. They put together basically a pickup team of smoke jumpers, dropped them in without any real situational awareness of what to expect. When the jumpers got in, they saw that both parts of the ridge above the Gulf were engulfed in flames, and the flames were going out of control. They had expected to be able to bring this thing under control by 10 o'clock the next morning, that it was an easy fire to fight. It wasn't. So what happened was Wag Dodge, the leader, got an interesting idea that if he lit a fire, it would burn out fuel. And so the main fires would go around it and create a zone of safety. So he told his team members to drop your tools and lie down. That order made absolutely no sense to the firefighters. What's a firefighter without tools? And laying down in the midst of the inferno rather than trying to escape it made even less sense to him. That's why Blake, when he wrote the article, called it the collapse of sense-making, and he coined the term sense-making. Sense-making is really a combination of situational awareness, understanding what's going on, and making a decision on how to react to it. And it's an ongoing process. It's really not much different, to be quite honest, than most people who are engaged in some sort of a crisis or problem solving get into. But it's a term that took the sociologists by storm. And unfortunately, the term drop your tools has also kind of taken root in the sociologist literature. I came across this in a leadership course I'm taking. As we'll discuss in a minute, I think White and the sociologists have drawn the wrong conclusions from Man Gulch. So now let's look at Bloody Ridge. Dark days, 1942, the Japanese have been on a roll. The Americans have successfully taken Guadalcanal, largely to get the airstrip there, which is named Henderson Field. Japanese immediately land forces. They had control of the seas at the point in time, so they could move forces in fairly readily. And they were hell-bent on taking Henderson Field back. So General Vandegraff put a proven leader and proven troops on the ridge line that he was pretty sure the Japanese had to come across. In the middle of a tremendously chaotic fight, Red Mike Edison, the commander, is standing up, directing things, and as he sees things coming closer and closer to a crisis situation, he yells, "Raiders, rally to me. Raiders, parachuters, engineers, artillerymen, I don't give a damn who you are. You're all Marines, come up and fight." They understood that. It made sense to them. They didn't have to engage in individual sense-making. It's what they expected their commander to do. Net result is, even though they suffered some horrific casualties, I believe there were about 50 killed and over 200 wounded and missing, they stopped the Japanese attack, which had strategic ramifications because the Japanese hadn't been defeated before in a major unit like that. They essentially stopped what they were doing when he stopped their attack on Port Moresby, which was key to taking Australia, and redeployed their forces to take back Guadalcanal. And fortunately, the Marines and later on Army units that reinforced the Marines were able to hold on to Guadalcanal, and that was really the major turning point in the war in the Pacific. So, Man Gulch, I think we see an institutional failure, and Bloody Ridge, we see an institutional success. The Forestry Service, when they dropped those poor smoke jumpers in, really had almost no situational awareness of what was going on. Their tactics, techniques, and procedures, I think, were probably flawed because they were based upon individual firefighters doing individual tasks rather than a group. Now, that might have worked in a normal fire, but when you're jumping smoke jumpers into the midst of a fire, you're almost by definition putting them into a crisis situation. And if that's not a tightly cohesive team, you open the door for all sorts of problems, and you get the crisis that we saw at Man Gulch. On the other side, the institution was a tremendous success. Vandegrift understood what the issues were. He understood where he thought the main crisis point was going to be, and he put his best leader and his best troops up on that ridge and was a success and won. So let's back away a little bit from Man Gulch and Bloody Ridge and just look at it from the sense-making and institutional perspective. As I said, the sense-making at the forestry level frankly didn't happen. They weren't providing any meaningful information into the units that were deployed to fight the fire, and as a result, sense-making broke down at that organizational level. Did not happen at Bloody Ridge. Bad things happened at Bloody Ridge, but the organization was a success and was able to make sense of the situation, gain situational awareness, and move troops to where they needed to be moved at the critical points in the battle. So how does this relate to critical thinking and resilience? Well, I had a lot of problems with White's article. I think he did come up with a good concept of what makes organizations resilient. And these are the 4 points that he brings up. Improvisation and bricolage. In other words, thinking on your feet and executing that improvisation. You have to have virtual role systems. Particularly in a crisis, as things break down and maybe as people get killed or hurt, people have to be able to step up. You have to understand what the roles are in that organization, and somebody has to be able to come in and take over as need be and make the right decisions. The attitude of wisdom. Now, I'll be quite honest, I'm still struggling a little bit with what White means by the attitude of wisdom, but what it means to me, and we'll get into it in a few minutes when we get into critical thinking, is the appropriate application of knowledge to a situation to resolve a problem. And then respectful interaction. This is all about treating people in a dignified way, addressing problems rather than blaming people. And I always go back to what I learned as a plebe at West Point, Schofield's definition of discipline, about how you treat soldiers to make them reliable in battle, and it doesn't come from harsher tyrannical treatment. Now let's look at critical thinking, which we see on the right. The central figure is a joker, and maybe wondering why in the world would you use a joker for critical thinking? In a medieval court, the joker was probably one of the smarter guys around, and he was able to tell the king or the duke or whoever was head of that particular court the truth based upon humor. It did not necessarily come into the face of the ruler, but at least it got the message across to the ruler and got him to think. So that's really kind of the word aletheia that you see in Greek at the top. Aletheia means truth, but also it literally means not to forget. It's all about lessons learned, and I think that those are critical as we get forward. A little bit, I'll explain that a little bit more. At the bottom you see ordo ad chao, order out of chaos. Red Mike Edison was able to bring order out of chaos, and his unit succeeded. Unfortunately, Wag Dodge was not able to bring order out of chaos, and 13 firefighters died. So let's now look at what the Joker is facing. And the key aspects of critical thinking are: what assumptions do you make? Assumptions are what you put in place when you don't have a fact. What facts are out there? What biases and preconceptions do you have? Because biases and preconceptions can blind you to the truth. They can make it difficult for data to come through your perceptual filters to be used for decision making. What are your emotions and feelings? Particularly in a crisis situation, emotions and feelings run high, and it could undermine your ability to rationally think through a problem. That's why logic and reason is important out there, as well as analysis and synthesis. The questions that are over there on the right, why? I think it's important to understand, why are you there? What's happening? Why is it happening? Cui bono, who benefits? Sine qua non, what is the essential component, the root cause, if you will? Area Mercatatis is the golden mean, and caribus paribus, all other things being equal, what should be happening that's not happening. So let's see if we can take this down into another level of analysis then. Here we introduce a couple things here. You see on the left a set of scales. And the scales have wisdom and understanding. We talked about wisdom a few minutes ago. Let's look at understanding. It is really getting a grasp of the facts and the situation and having an in-depth understanding of what's happening and why. Thinking through those questions that were on the right hand of the Joker. And making some decisions and then using judgment as a combination of wisdom and understanding to decide what to do. Now, deciding what to do, particularly in a crisis, we're looking at balancing innovation and execution. We can innovate until the cows come home and just keep thinking of great ideas. But if we don't get into the execution of those ideas, the firefighters are going to die and Bloody Ridge is going to fall. At some point we have to say the innovation is good enough, let's execute it. We'll talk a little bit more about that Nautilus in a second. But what's important about the Nautilus is it starts introducing that concept of golden mean, how we relate one thing to another. Because the facts and the assumptions have to come together and be related to come to that cohesive picture and situational understanding. The sense making, if you will. We bring in the hermit now. And you're probably thinking, well, what the hell is a hermit doing in a critical thinking model? Hermits live in caves, they're reclusive. The hermit stands for intuition here. Okay, it's our gut feeling. Now, what intuition, that gut feeling is really our subconscious mind at work. If you think back to aletheia, meaning not to forget, it's the sum total of all the things that we've experienced. So as we're looking at that situation, our subconscious is playing the current situation against what we've dealt with in the past and bubbling up intuitive ideas of how to handle it. So we've got to be able to balance the hermit, the intuition, with the logical reasoning capabilities that are part of critical thinking. If we leave the hermit out, particularly in a crisis situation when things are happening quickly, we may make the right decision for the wrong reasons and still be wrong. Now, key tools within critical thinking are perception, analysis, problem solving, evaluation, synthesis, and reflection. Perception is absolutely important in this thing. It's how we gain that situational awareness, how we engage in that sense making, if you will. But if our biases and our preconditions set up rigid filters, that data is not going to get into our analysis process. We've got to understand what those biases and preconceptions are and lower those filters as required to let more and more data in so that when we analyze the data and we fuse it with our intuition, we're able to come up with some meaningful problem solving to address the crisis or the problem at hand. Evaluation. Now that we've come up with our innovations, do we think it's going to work? Answer, yes, we execute. We've got to execute vigorously. Then, once we're finished, we have to go back through a synthesis and reflection. And this is how we get that data back into our subconsciousness to keep refining our intuition so when that hermit comes back out, the hermit's up to date. Our intuition is up to date. We can count and rely on that intuition. We bring in the golden mean. This is critical as we're looking at our analysis and what is important, what are those essential conditions and how do they relate to each other. Some things are going to be very important, some things less so. How do we balance those things together? We don't want to forget those things that we originally think are not important, because as the crisis or the situation continues to unfold, those things that were once deemed unimportant, they become more important, and we have to cycle back through that innovation and execution process. So resiliency. Let's go back to some things that Mike mentioned. Resiliency has three components to it: the time to failure, the speed of recovery, and the degree of recovery. It operates on a mental, and an emotional, and a physical basis. We can't forget all three of them interface together seamlessly. Going back to those feelings that were in the prior slide, if the emotions are ignored, that's bad. But if they're allowed to run rampant, that's just as bad as well. Because as we're getting run down and depressed, it influences our thinking and our ability to physically put into play the decisions that we make. So let's look at some dynamics of resiliency. The U is long-term resiliency. It's what happens after the crisis or the problem that the organization learns, adjusts, and transforms as a result of those lessons learned. Now think about that rubber ball. When you drop that rubber band ball, it bounces back and forth to us. That's the energy of the crisis coming back at us. It's the ability to respond to it. Now we think about that daisy you see. In this case, the daisy on the left is wilted, lack of water. If we get to the daisy in time when we provide the water, it's able to blossom back out. We've got to take care of the responders, the people, the system, and provide it the resources that it needs in order to be resilient so that we can get to that longer term aspect of resiliency. So I'd like to thank you very much and wish you a wonderful day.